certain portion of the population, but my point to you, Mr. Speaker, is that it's not accessible to the average citizen. I'm now going to go into some refutation. Harris had 3 points. His first point was talking about efficiency. He said in the U.S., hospitals compete for services, doctors compete for patients. This makes it more efficient. This does not make it more efficient, Mr. Speaker. What it does is it encourages a waste of service because doctors will sort of throw out whatever procedures people are willing to pay for them. This is why the U.S. spends more than twice as much per capita and as a portion of GDP on healthcare than Canada does. So I don't understand how, with that stat standing, side prop here can tell you that healthcare in the U.S. is somehow more efficient. What it is maybe more like not all-inclusive, but more like doing everything possible to make sure they cover all their bases. But again, this is A, only for people who can afford it, and B, wastes a huge amount of money, which we would contend is not actually a good thing. He talked about brain drain. There's not actually a very large difference in physicians per capita between the U.S. and Canada. It's something like 2.1 per thousand and 2.3 per thousand. It's not as large as Harris is making it sound, so this isn't really an issue. And again, this whole efficiency thing about U.S. being better, it's only if you can afford it, and that's something that you should keep in mind while listening to the rest of Prop's speech. He continued to talk about how only the rich can get healthcare in Canada, and in the U.S. no one will be will be refused. I think I've explained this in my point about accessibility. It's exactly the opposite. In Canada, everyone's guaranteed healthcare, maybe with waiting times, but they'll get it eventually. In the U.S., you will be turned away. I don't completely understand what Harris is talking about when he says you won't be turned away. If I have cancer and I don't have insurance, or I have Medicaid or some sort of bare insurance like that, I will be turned away. He talked about the hidden costs of Canada and about how in Canada you do pay for some things like drugs. The costs of drugs in Canada are significantly cheaper than the same drugs in the U.S., so much so that people in the U.S. buy drugs from Canada instead of buying them from the U.S. So yes, maybe there is this one cost, but that cost exists in the U.S. as well, more so, in addition to all the other costs that aren't covered by health insurance. So this may be a small flaw, but it pales in comparison to the flaws of the U.S. system. He also talked about the value of choice, and this is sort of where we place our main contention on side opposition. This idea that it's your choice to get sick, that you should be rewarded for good behavior and somehow that you can avoid getting sick, and this is motivation to avoid getting sick. I don't think I have to explain that getting sick is often not an intentional choice, and there's often nothing you can do to avoid it. The second part of this point is that you should be able to decide if you want health care. And that the people who don't want it in the U.S. are uninsured because they choose to do. And this is obviously not the case, Mr. Speaker. Maybe a small portion don't want it, but the vast majority would love that security net and just can't afford it. So for these reasons, Mr. Speaker, we on side opposition strongly oppose. Thank you.
I thank the member for her remarks. I now call upon the second speaker for side proposition.
Can you turn the mic on?
Is it not on?
I don't think it is.
Oh, well, I don't know how to turn it on.
Okay.
There's a light on it.
It's on. It's on.
It is only on for recording.
Ladies and gentlemen, when you're sick, the fundamental thing that you care about is getting better. And on that note, I'm going to be bringing forth two constructive arguments to show why the U.S. is the best place to do this. So both of these, these arguments are entitled, the first of which is severity, and I'm going to be talking about how sort of the American system deters sort of the emergency room being filled with hypochondriacs and not emergencies. And second, I'm going to be talking to you about how there is a different mindset in the American system, one which we believe fosters a more professional relationship and a more direct relationship than that of Canada, and why that is more beneficial to the individual. And from there, I'm going to refute side opposition's points and rebuild all of my partners' points. So let's go into my first constructive argument. Ladies and gentlemen, we see that in the American system decreases hypochondriacs in hospital and improves medical performance and efficiency. So let's look at how it does this. We see, as my partner already mentioned, there is a shortage of general practitioners in Canada. And by doing so, it sends people to the emergency room. Okay, so we see that the problem is that people are going to go in Canada when they don't necessarily have an emergency because it's free, because it's covered. So what's the difference? We see that in America, when money is involved, when you now have to pay, we see that this is going to make you think, is the fact that my daughter has a runny nose really a big deal? Is the fact that my daughter stubbed her toe on a table really a big deal? Ladies and gentlemen, it makes you think, and we see that it's going to deter people from going into the emergency room when they don't really have an emergency. And we see that that is the main, that is the foundation and the premise of an emergency room treating emergencies. And that is sort of what we'd like the emergency room to be filled with, ladies and gentlemen, not mothers with their daughters having runny noses. So what we're seeing is that this is going to clear up the emergency rooms, and from there it's going to be it's going to be clearing up the emergency rooms of those who don't necessarily need to be there. And we see that this is going to be de-stressing doctors and medical staff slightly because you don't have emergency rooms that are jam-filled with people who don't necessarily actually need to be there. And we see that this reduces the chance of mistakes, botched surgeries, etc., because they're all in a rush. I think it's a pretty logical argument. Sure.
Don't you think Canadian emergency rooms do a really good job of prioritizing people, so they'll take the person who has the biggest emergency first and save the runny nose for later?
Yeah, that's great, but the problem is, Lewis, that they're still there. You still have all these people in the emergency room that don't need to be there, and we believe that the fact that they don't need to be there, ladies and gentlemen, means that they shouldn't be there. That the United States system encourages people to go to the emergency room when they have an emergency, something we believe to be fundamentally important. So anyways, I'd like to continue with my speech. So we believe that what this essentially does is promoting order and is in accordance with what the goal of a hospital or emergency room is, which is treating emergencies. A runny nose, ladies and gentlemen, is not an emergency. However, it is a small thing with a very large negative effect. And we see that to be a problem, and that the American system solves that problem. Now, I'd like to move on to my second argument, which is sort of the larger argument to bring forth here today about how there is a different mindset in America. We see that the American system has a different yet fundamentally better system that caters to the individual. That caters to the sick person. So we have a Canadian mindset where the healthcare system is responsible to the government, however an American one where the healthcare system is responsible to the patient. Now an American mindset fosters a professional relationship, what we see today, as this patient now becomes your client. We see that doctors are liable to the patient through this direct exchange of money and services. We see that you pay me and I give you the best service possible. We see a direct liability here to the patient. We believe it creates motivation for the doctor and logical decisions can be made because there is a direct exchange going on here today, and that it's a very simple exchange. You are dealt with on an individual basis, and ladies and gentlemen, to be dealt with on an individual basis is the most efficient way to get better. To not have third parties of the government to not have the doctors being liable to third parties, which are the government, is a more efficient system than is a less efficient system, my mistake, than having the doctors liable to the patients, than having the doctors treat the patients with their minds. No thanks. So we believe that an individual person fundamentally cares about how they can get better, not the whole of society, as the Canadian system sort of goes along with, as the Canadian system is very utilitarian. We see that the American system is much less so, much less catering to the individual, and what a sick person cares about, ladies and gentlemen, is getting better, and that is what the U.S. system caters to. Now I'd like to move on to the refutation of side of opposition's points. So she talked a lot about accessibility here today, and she had a point. She talked about job loss and job lock. And she said, well, first of all, she said, if you're an average person, you're not going to get this high quality medical care that my partner's been talking about so much. Ladies and gentlemen, due to this brain drain of doctors into the United States, we see a higher concentration of strong and competent doctors, making it a higher average than in Canada. So even the average care, ladies and gentlemen, is higher than the average care in Canada. We're seeing that even if you can't achieve the best, which is in fact better than the best in Canada, the average is also in fact better than the average in Canada. No thanks, Lewis. Now, we see next what they talked about was this old idea of a job, and they said that in the U.S. after 12 weeks you can be fired based on your medical condition. Ladies and gentlemen, a company cannot fire you based on your medical condition. That is discrimination and is against what companies stand by in both the United States and in Canada. So I don't really know where side of opposition was going with that, because they cannot and they do not do that, ladies and gentlemen, firing you based on your medical condition and based on the fact that you've used up all of your medical coverage. They cannot and do not do that. Now, she also talked about qualifying for Medicaid, and she talked about how a lot of people can't afford health care. Ladies and gentlemen, everyone can afford health care. You may not necessarily be able to afford the best health care, but there are different levels and different varying levels of health care available.